So now we will speak about Kotlin and how to deal with the transition to Java to Kotlin in the real world. So thank you to applause James, who comes from the US, just for you. So please applause him. Thank you, James.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So just a quick question. How many of you guys are native French speakers? Okay, everybody. All right, so I'm going to do something risky and possibly stupid. That's why I stepped from behind. But so we'll see how this goes. Bonjour, je m'appelle James Williams. Je suis américain, mais je parle français. Je bosse à... Merci. Je bosse à Udacity. C'est une société qui est située dans Silicon Valley. Nous créons des codes de programmation qui s'appellent NanoDegree. Je suis le content developer / curriculum lead pour Android. Content developer, c'est-à-dire une personne qui est responsable pour créer des codes de programmation. Pour moi, personnellement, c'est Android. Et curriculum lead, c'est une personne qui dirige la direction de le contenu pour un domaine. Peut-être vous vous demandez pourquoi ce Américain est capable de parler français. Je me suis spécialisé en la langue française et l'informatique à la fac. Et pour un peu environ 6 mois, j'étais un étudiant Erasmus dans le Nord. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to English, but thanks for that. So this talk is going to, and these lights are really bright, but I can't see without my glasses, so we'll figure that out. So this talk is going to kind of take you on a journey that I went on converting an Android app from Java into Kotlin. It's going to try to introduce the Kotlin concepts in time. And so it won't be a from zero tutorial on Kotlin, and it won't talk about all of the features of Kotlin, but just the things that I felt were most applicable to Android. So for those of you that may not know, Kotlin is a statically typed programming language for the JVM. It's 100% compatible with Java, which is awesome because we can use it in Android. It has first-class IDE support in the IntelliJ IDEA, and also Android Studio, of course. And then it can also compile to JavaScript or native code. And here's a link for the daily. So one of the things that Kotlin addresses is sometimes called the billion-dollar mistake, and that's from the guy who created Null, because Nulls, as you probably have had the pain of dealing with, cause a lot of problems in our programs. Kotlin seeks to kind of solve that by making it very hard to make something null. So by default, a variable cannot be null, and generally you have to assign its value when you're making the declaration. Nulls can be created with some special kind of directives, but in general, you should try to not use null ever if you can help it. The project that we're going to be looking at is called Stockhawk. It's a former project in the Android NanoDegree program, shameless plug. And what students had to do is finish an implementation of a stock viewer. And it's a couple of screen things, so it's not your hello world with Kotlin. You have to think about different concerns about how to get data and things like that. The app looks like this. So the first thing that I needed to do and I'll walk over here to like be mobile and give these people some love, is add Kotlin to stock. And you need to actually add it to two parts of your code, your outer build.gradle file, and your internal build.gradle file. And this is what you need to add as a dependency to your outer build.gradle file, just saying that you are going to use the Gradle plugin with your app. And then in the internal one, you want to apply the plugin, the Kotlin plugin, and include as a dependency the standard library for Kotlin. My first tip here is you should not mass convert to Kotlin. I know that you might have seen videos that say, oh, well, you just select everything, right-click, and click Convert to Kotlin. Don't do that. What you should do instead is convert into each file individually. Now, the reason why I suggest that you don't convert en masse is just when Kotlin tries to do its conversions, it doesn't know some of the things about your app. So it might convert things in a weird way that will introduce problems when you try to run it. So here is a bit of code from the app for a quote intent service and in Java. And we've probably all seen this before. Well, not this specific code before because I'm just showing it, but code like this before. And here's how it looks in Kotlin. So there are a couple of different things going on here. We have the class declaration just like in Java, but one thing that we'll notice is there's no extends keyword here. The way that Kotlin extends or implements an interface is by using the colon. The next thing that we'll see is intent service now has a parameter like it's a constructor call behind it. What you need to do in Kotlin, when you're creating a class, you need to declare a default constructor. In this case, for quote intent service, it's a no argument constructor, and it's calling the super constructor for intent service. So if we flip back, we can see that that's a direct translation of that code from before. Another thing that we'll notice here is that the override keyword has changed to, the override annotation has changed to just the keyword override. And it is squeaky like right here. Weird. Okay, sorry. And there is a FUN for function declaration that happens at the front of the function. The third thing that I want you to look at is the fact that when you're declaring a parameter, it's actually the type information comes behind the name of the variable instead of in front of. We see the change from intent to intent : intent. The fourth thing that is here is there is a question mark behind intent. Now what that says is this intent can be null or have the actual value of an intent. Generally, you should try to avoid this, but sometimes it needs to be that way. Here's another class that expands a little bit and shows us how we would declare functions that have a return type. So just like the parameters for a function, the return type's going to come after. And here is a very simple class called stuff. And I wanted to show you this one just to show you how you can declare instance variables. So in the constructor, which is that stuff, val A, var B, what you're actually doing there is, in addition to declaring the class, you're saying this class is going to have variables named A and B of type string and type int. For the first one, VAL, that means that that value cannot be changed once it's assigned. VAR, on the other hand, can be changed. And there are some weird, not really weird, but one thing that a lot of people sort of confuse val with is that when you're using a val, it doesn't make something immutable. It just makes it not reassignable. So if you have a list of something, you can call add and remove and stuff on that list, but you can't change it to a new value of a list. And we can see in the code below that if we try to reassign A, it's going to cause a compiler error. So one of the first things that I did in the app after changing the quote intent services over was updating the data model. So the original used what I consider a typical contract SQL-Lite implementation, and the new version uses RM-Lite, which eventually I'll change this over to RUM, but when I was starting to do this talk, RUM was a bit too beta for me. And one of the things that we've probably written a lot in Java are POJOs, plain old Java classes, plain old Java objects, that generally don't have any functions inside of them. They're just meant to hold data. Kotlin has a version of that called data classes. And here's kind of an example of a data class. And it has a bit of annotations on top of it. But for the stock, it holds a symbol price change and percent change. And we have our database annotations here. Those didn't change from Java. Those are just the same exact ones. One of the cool things about data classes, or classes in general, in Kotlin, is when you pass in these values after it, which are default values, it makes it where you don't have to create 4 and 5 different constructors. Like this one constructor can be addressed by all 3 of these. Because what it's doing is, for each of these values, if you don't assign anything, it's going to plug in whatever the default value is that you declared in the class declaration, sorry, tongue-tied. So moving on with the database layer, I have my database stack DAO. One of the new things in this slide is a companion object that kind of corresponds to static final in Java. There are a couple of little differences, but it's mostly the same. Another new thing is late init. Now, late init is one of the ways where you can defer instantiating something until later. Next, after that, is the init block, and that's what gets executed in your default constructor. So when I instantiate stack.do, it's going to assign the quote DIO and the regular DAO. But I could also, if I didn't want to do that, and I shouldn't do that if I'm going to assign it that close after, I can put it into the companion object. And when it's in the companion object, those are essentially static. So they don't have multiple versions running around and stuff like that. One of the things that coming from the Groovy programming language and other dynamic languages that let you work with collections very fluently is give you a bunch of functions for like map reduce and things like that. That's not really as exposed in Java. So one of the things that I used to use was Google Guava, but with Kotlin, I found that I've not needed to use that. Kotlin has a set of collections, both mutable and immutable, and it's slightly different from the way that you would declare a collection in Java. Like you could still use the array list or hash map or something like that. But in the standard library, there's also functions for list of, map of. And it's kind of a sort of personal preference on whether you want to use the old Java way or use the Kotlin way based off of how you feel it reads or it looks. But they're essentially the same exact implementation. Also in the standard library, you have MapReduce type functions like filtering, map, group, find, partition, taking the last, taking the first, that sort of thing. So you can do things like this. Now this is in our DAO object, and it grabs all of the stocks and then does a map closure and grabs just a symbol and then returns a list of all the symbols that are in our DAO. We can take it a bit further and sort our quotes by the date and then take the last 30 of them. So if you've developed an Android a while, you've probably heard of or used Butterknife from Jake Wharton. He wrote a Kotlin version called Cotterknife that, like most of the other things I've shown, lets you write very concise code. So to add it to your project, you just pop in that code. And this is the Butterknife code that I originally had, and it changed over to this Cotterknife code, where I have the declaration of the value and then by function bind view that takes in the parameter of the ID of the element that I'm using. There we go. Now the way that works is by using delegation. Delegation can be done several ways, but the way that it's commonly done in Kotlin is using the by keyword, where you can say you want certain functions on an object to be delegated to something else. And this is a common pattern that you see in iOS a lot. So in this example, stock recycler view is having its instantiation delegated to the bind view function. And yeah. Another way that you can do delegation is using lazy. Lazy delegation works by saying you have this closure code block, lambda of code that's going to be run, and it's not going to actually run it until the first time you reference it. So if this were in an app, it would show the date. It would store the value the date is the first time that it actually was referenced, not when the program runs. Well, not when the variable was declared, rather. So one of the other things in Kotlin that the JetBrains team has put out is a set of libraries called Unco. And Unco Commons is a tool set that includes helpers for things like intents and coroutines and dialogues and things like that. So I'm going to show you some of my favorites from Unco Commons, and you can add it with this code. And here is a direct translation of what an intent would look like, just written in Kotlin code, but we can do better than this. We can turn it into this code. Now what this code is doing is it's using one of the things in the Kotlin standard library called a pair, and a pair is a basic tuple that has two values, and each type in Kotlin has a to function that's been added to it. So you can do string, so in this case, Its stock is a string, and symbol is a string, so it's going to store a pair with one string that's stock and one string that's the symbol that's in the value. One way that this is used a lot is when you're referencing something that has maps. Some people like to use this as a more fluent, more readable way of saying the map values versus doing it more the Java way. And there are a couple of other intent helpers that are included in Anko. The ones that have been most useful for me is usually just browse and the shortened this guy. But these other ones are here as well. Uncle Logger is another useful tool for me. And this one is, when I've been talking to friends and stuff about it, this is one that is a bit, I wouldn't say controversial, but it's a personal preference of whether you want to do it. It's not going to change your life to use a different logger, so to speak. One of the reasons why I'd say it's a personal choice is Uncle Logger is a bit more verbose than Android.utillog or Timber. One of the benefits, though, is that for Uncle Logger, as opposed to Android.utillog, you don't have to do the whole static final string tag equals whatever my long class name is thing. To be fair, you don't have to do that in Timber either, but for Anko, you don't need to add any extra code in an application class or thing like that. You can just have your class extend, implement Anko Logger, and use those functions, and everything works fine. Pardon. Singletons. We've probably written a lot of these, and these are just painful gang of four sort of pattern that we all have to deal with to make sure that there's only one of a thing. This was probably my favorite part of Kotlin, is that instead of all of this stuff, I can write this. And it's the exact same thing. Objects are objects, which you're not supposed to use the word to define the thing. Objects are things that cannot be instantiated. And there's kind of, once they're declared, they exist, and you can use them like any other class. They can extend from other classes. They can implement interfaces. They're all around awesome. So going back to Stockhawk, this is what my data service turned into. It turned into an object so that I could make sure that there was only one version of it, and I have the functions that I'm calling on it, and it's all awesome. With is another sort of pattern that it's a personal preference as well. I personally like to use it just because I used it in Groovy, but let's just look at the code. So here is a sync quotes job object, and this one was implemented with the builder pattern, so you can do the chained, set this, set that sort of thing. With, you can change it to this. I personally like it just because it allows me to understand what is happening on the specific object, because depending on people that you code with, you might have lines that are like 100 characters long and stuff like that. So I prefer to use this no matter what. So even if it isn't using the builder pattern, I always use with because it can give me an interface that looks the same no matter what the implementation is for the underlying library or class. So let's talk about nullability again. As I mentioned before, Null Safety is built into Kotlin, and you do have nullable types. Here's a quick recap from before. The question mark after means that we can assign it to null or to that thing. But every time we reference that object, and it's squeaking right here, sorry, we have to call question mark dot to make sure that we're not passing, that we're not going to throw a null pointer exception. And if you don't call that, the compiler is going to yell at you, which is kind of awesome that you can catch it at the compiler level as opposed to when your code is running. Another thing, and I don't recommend this, is with double exclamation points. And what that does is it will return the null, it will allow the null pointer exception to advance if the thing is null. I haven't found a real reason why someone would want to do this, but when you are converting your app converting classes from Java to Kotlin using the IDE, a lot of times it would change references to use this double exclamation point. So just be aware that it's there. I think that it might be useful if you need sort of compatibility with a Java library that it's expecting null. That could be it, but I just don't like using that at all. So you can avoid needing null firstly by using late initialization, that late init keyword that we talked about earlier. Another way is lazy initialization. Just don't use null. And those were my tips. And actually, organizers, do we have like a mic to pass around for questions, or do they ask me after? Oh, they asked me after? Okay. All right. So additional Kotlin resources, check out the Kotlin cones, kotlinlang.org. There's also a book by Antonio Leva, not sure how to say his last name, so I'll say it both ways. What he does is he takes the application that we used at Udacity in our developing Android apps course, an application called Sunshine, a weather app, and he takes you through the process of creating that application from scratch in Kotlin. So I really advise you to check that out because it's an awesome book. And with that, I'm finished. But before you start clapping, si vous avez des questions, venez me voir après. Donc. Then